Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with finally another installment in my Roman series. And this has been inspired by some recent historical fiction reading I've been doing. Some of you may know I have been reading a historical fiction duology about the Emperor Nero, and it has really spiraled me into a point of obsession with him. I decided pretty immediately upon finishing the first book, which is The Confessions of Young Nero by Margaret George, that I would have to do a history chat of some kind on Nero. And so that's what this was originally intended to be. But I think I have so much information here and divided into so many different sections that it might make sense to kind of do a little bit of a series on Nero himself. But I thought that I would talk a little bit about Nero because I think, sadly, what we know about Nero and what we have interpreted about Nero over the years has largely been historical fiction. So this series that I have been reading has absolutely been partial to Nero and everything that Nero has been through, to the point where I would say Nero is kind of portrayed as a saint. He is incredibly whitewashed. You would believe him innocent of basically every crime. Whereas in the ancient histories of famous historians such as Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, Nero is given the opposite treatment. He is treated very much as a debauched, corrupt ruler who never did anything right. And I don't think either of these interpretations is correct. And what's difficult with Nero is it's very hard to suss out what is actual fact. You wish that you could really rely on these ancient historians, but many of you probably know ancient histories were not written in the way that modern history books are. So they are in no way, shape, or form unbiased. They're not even trying to tell you an unbiased version of events. There's a lot of embellishment in ancient histories. There's a lot of kind of storytelling. And frankly, when these people were writing, it's really not that far off from when Nero lived. And so you might can imagine that people who came into power after Nero had a vested interest in making him look pretty badly. And so there's a really interesting discussion, I think, around Nero personally and around the way he has been discussed in various sources over the centuries. But I thought that we could start today with just a video on Nero, kind of an introductory video to Nero, to his time period, and to the people who are around him, which I think is really interesting, and I think is kind of the sad thing about Nero as a person and Nero as an emperor, is that he is surrounded by incredibly fascinating people who are really wonderful historical figures in their own right. And so I think he kind of comes off as a little bit, not boring next to them, but he's not the most interesting player on the field, in my opinion. He's surrounded by a lot of artists, a lot of athletes, a lot of political schemers, and Nero is all of those things, but he's not the best at any one of them. So in some ways, I feel a little bit sorry for Nero, and the fictional portrayal of him in Margaret George's series has really endeared me to him, and I find myself actually really liking Nero and confronting the fact that I have viewed Nero a certain way for the majority of my life, and whether or not that's actually true, whether or not that's actually factual. So who is Nero? Nero is technically the 5th Roman emperor, and he is the last of the Julio-Claudian Dynasty, which I would say is probably the most famous family dynasty in Rome's history. It's really, really famous. All members of it are famous in their own right. And if you're like me, over the years, you have likely conflated Nero with Caligula, who was his uncle. I will insert a family tree here because I do think it will be helpful in so many ways. These people are very interrelated. There's a lot of adoption that happens in the Julio-Claudian dynasty, and adoption becomes pretty much a standard practice for the Roman Empire as a whole. And so there's a lot of overlap in these family trees. He was born December 15th, 37 AD, so he was a Sagittarius represent. I am also a Sagittarius. Maybe that's why I like him. I kind of sympathize with him. But he died June 9th, 68 AD, and we know that for sure. And you might can tell from those dates that Nero was quite young when he bit the dust. And so you might can imagine quite a bit happened in his very short life. And a lot of it seems as though it was largely out of his control, particularly in his earlier life. So he reigned as emperor from 54 to 68 AD, which is a pretty long reign, all things considered. There are many Roman emperors who ruled for a few months and then were killed. So Nero has actually a pretty good track record in that regard. He did quite a bit in his reign that was viewed fairly positively by the people of Rome in particular. But then he also did things that were really, really uncouth for Romans of his class to do at this period in time, which kind of starts his reputation as a fairly debauched person. And that's what I would really like to get to the bottom of with this series. And I don't think that we will, but I would really like to get to the bottom of whether or not Nero really is as bad as people have always said that he was. Nero has been maligned in nearly every source written after him, and often by people that you would assume had no real beef with him, had no real argument with him as a person. But you also have to take into account things like kind of the changing dynasties. People who are in power maybe 25, 30, 100 years afterwards really don't look favorably on Nero. And so they may not want you to write a really wonderful portrait of Nero in your history. But on the other hand, some of the things that they say Nero did are so incredibly crazy, and it really beggars belief. And so to get into those, I think we should start with, of course, his early life. So Nero's childhood was fairly wrought. He grew up in an incredibly hostile environment where Caligula, his uncle, was emperor. And as you might can imagine, that was not great. Nero is not directly in line for the throne when he's first born, and he's not even called Nero when he's first born. Though Nero definitely is part of the dynasty as a child, and he's also a figure of a fair amount of importance at this time in Roman court, he is not actually directly in line to become emperor. That happens when his mother, who is a character in her own right, Agrippina the Younger, marries Claudius, who became emperor after Caligula. Now, Claudius is a really famous Roman emperor, and he's famous largely due to I, Claudius, which was written by Robert Graves, a historical fiction series that was eventually adapted into a BBC miniseries. And he became really famous due to that. He's actually always been a Roman emperor that was fairly forgotten before Robert Graves gave him some proper attention. Claudius is a really interesting character, and he's often looked down upon by everyone at the time because he's not really a physical person. So he has a stutter, he has a limp, he's viewed as useless because of those qualities. But because of those qualities, he's often sat around and been unnoticed, and so Claudius has really kind of honed his mind. Claudius is not stupid, and he is a better Roman emperor than most people at the time would ever have admitted. But Agrippina the Younger, who is a really, really interesting figure, but she's very conniving, she's very arrogant, she's very ambitious. She really wants Nero in the succession line. And Claudius does have a child. Claudius has a son, and Claudius also has a daughter from a former marriage. Now, whether or not these children were actually Claudius's is still up for debate, because Claudius had so many health issues, it's often thought, could he really have fathered children? And his wife was discovered to have an affair, and that's kind of what happened to her. That's why she was out of the picture, and Agrippina the Younger could come in. But Nero is older than those children, not by much, but enough to kind of gain manhood before Claudius's son, Britannicus. So Agrippina persuades Claudius to adopt Nero and have Nero be his heir. After this happens, after Nero is kind of confirmed as being adopted by Claudius, Claudius dies under fairly suspicious circumstances, and most historians, most ancient historians at that, firmly believe Agrippina poisoned him. So Nero succeeds Claudius, and when he succeeds Claudius, he is only 16 years old, and so he's actually the youngest Roman emperor until around the 200s. There is another emperor who was actually 14 when he became the emperor, but at the time, Nero was absolutely the youngest person ever to have become the Roman emperor. And thus, he's still young enough to be manipulated by the people around him. And he's manipulated in particular by his mother. His mother really controls his early reign. And this is actually when most of kind of his favorable decisions take place. And so some scholars will argue that you can't really say Nero was the one doing this, that it was actually Agrippina who was making all of these really favorable decisions for Rome. And perhaps you might think, well, if Nero's not viewed favorably, then his mother must be, if she was the one kind of controlling the good part of his reign. But no, Agrippina is also viewed largely as a villain of this time period, which I think is really interesting. She really is a very fascinating figure. Overbearing mothers actually are a bit of a trend in the Roman Empire, I think most famously with Augustus and his mother. And so she's really not looked on very favorably, and none of these kind of overbearing mother types are, especially by the ancient historians. And most of the ancient historians, and a lot of modern historians at that, really believe that Agrippina intended to rule through her son, that she knew she could manipulate Nero. You might be questioning, where are Claudius's children in all of this? And I'm so glad you asked. Claudius's daughter, Octavia, goes on to marry Nero, who is not only her cousin, but is now her stepbrother by way of marriage, thanks to Agrippina marrying Claudius. This is a very convoluted family tree. So Octavia is essentially kind of out of the way because she is Nero's first wife. But Britannicus does try to kind of foment rebellion. He's really irritated by this, especially as he gets older and he understands kind of what has been taken from him. And there are people around him who truly believe the right of being emperor was stolen out from under him, and so they are kind of whispering in his ear. One of these figures is potentially Agrippina, Nero's mother, who doesn't like when Nero tries to kind of rebel against her, and so she decides to place her bets with Britannicus. This is argued. Some people believe she did this, some people don't. Either way, Britannicus is poisoned and he is out of the way. Perhaps one of the most famous kind of stories about Nero is that he very much wanted to be an artist, he wanted to be a poet, he wanted to be an athlete, and so he kind of surrounds himself with a lot of the greatest minds of the age. He was actually tutored by Seneca, who is a really famous Stoic of the period. He's friends with Lucan, who is a poet who is of relation to Seneca, and he also knows pretty well Petronius, the writer of the Satyricon. This is an aspect of Nero as a person that I really feel for and I feel sorry for because he is really looked down upon because of his interest in the arts and being an athlete. He in particular wants to be a charioteer. He really wants to race horses. And that is a bit of a class issue in the Roman Empire. It's viewed as something that somebody of a lower class would do, that nobody of kind of the upper echelons would ever be a charioteer. And in fact, they can't race. And also that they would never really get themselves involved in poetry, get themselves involved in art. Nero, of course, does all of these things because you can't control a Roman emperor. You can't tell them what to do. So he definitely does things that he wants to do, but this is increasingly frowned upon, and this is kind of a point where his reputation changes, where people start to view him very differently. Another instance where people start to really view him in a negative light is when he kills his mother. You might think Agrippina had it coming. And to a certain degree, I kind of think that because she raises Nero up to be just like her. And so what would she do if somebody was in the way of her in power? She'd kill them, and that's essentially what Nero does. Now, Nero's relationship with Agrippina has been fraught for a long time, and there is always this kind of underlying sexual tension between the two of them. Some people firmly believe that it kind of edged into incest. There are all sorts of accusations of incest against the two of them across the centuries, across the board. And a lot of people really believe they kind of consummated their relationship, and other people believe they just kind of had a really intense connection that's also very uncomfortable to think about. At any rate, it doesn't seem that anything in particular set him off here, but that he was just kind of growing increasingly irritated by her wanting to control him and to control his reign. Nero is a diva, as you might can imagine, since he's into poetry and art and all of that. He's really into showmanship, and so he arranges a shipwreck for his mother's death, which she survives. She actually survives. She crawls ashore. The man that Nero had organized the shipwreck physically slaughters her the second that she gets onto the beach. In so many ways, this is the beginning of the end for Nero, even though he still has years left to live, years left to reign, because actually the decisions that he made under Agrippina's tutelage were the ones that were really, really positive. They were the ones that were really well received by everyone. And it appears that he did far better under her tutelage than he does under his own. Nero is, of course, involved in a lot of other shady deaths across the rest of his reign. The death of his first wife, who he apparently forced to commit suicide. The death of his second wife, who he apparently kicked to death while she was pregnant. And then there are kind of the conspirators, Seneca, Lucan, a lot of people who were confirmed to be in a conspiracy against him, who really wanted to bring back the Roman Republic, which doesn't seem as though they really revolted against the idea of Nero personally, but more the idea of what Nero as an emperor represents, which is really interesting, though a lot of people were involved in this conspiracy because they hated Nero personally. They hated the fact that he wanted to be a charioteer. They hated the fact that he wanted to be a poet. They hated the fact that he killed his mother. And a lot of people really hated what happened to Octavia, who was, of course, Claudius's daughter. She was extremely well received as the Augusta, as the wife of the emperor. And a lot of people liked her and thus liked Nero because they thought she afforded him an air of legitimacy, let's say, because she was actually Claudius's real child. But perhaps the most egregious event of Nero's reign is the Great Fire of Rome that happens in 64 AD. This is a disaster the likes of which I cannot possibly describe to you. We in the modern day can have absolutely no idea how to fathom something like this, how to fathom a fire in the past. Everything is kind of built on top of each other. Everything is touching each other. Everything is leaning across the street, potentially into the next building. And so it is very easy for a fire to spread in the past. And the Great Fire of Rome devastated the city of Rome. Truly, we cannot imagine what was lost, and people's lives were utterly destroyed. People wanted to die after the fire because they had lost all of their family, they had lost their home, and they had lost their business in it, and they asked for death. It was that bad, and it raged for days. And if you have heard one thing about Nero, you have heard this. You have heard the rumor that he fiddled while Rome burned, or you have heard that he started the fire. I can put to rest the rumor about fiddling while Rome burned. That absolutely did not happen, as the fiddle had not yet been invented. I also think it's pretty egregious to accuse him of starting the fire, but a lot of people lay blame on Nero for starting the fire because of the Domus Aurea, which is this really grand palace house that he built after the fire of Rome. And so there's a lot of conspiracy even at the time that he set this fire because he really wanted to build this really grand palace. In terms of ancient sources for Nero, we have three main ones. They are Tacitus, Cassius Dio, and Suetonius. And of the three, Tacitus is the only one that doesn't outright blame Nero for the fire. He's not sure. Everyone else is pretty secure in their belief that Nero set this fire to make way for the Domus Aurea. You've probably also heard too that Nero blamed the fire on the Christians. He used Christians as a scapegoat because at the time Christians are a very small sect that is growing and posing threat to Roman religion. To my knowledge, this has never been confirmed, and I don't think there was ever in the entire history of the Roman Empire what one would term, you know, a full-fledged witch hunt for Christians. I think this happened, absolutely, but I think it happened on a smaller scale, and I think it happened in individual provinces. But I definitely think Nero allowed people to believe it. I don't really think this was his brainchild, but if people want to believe the Christians did it, let them, because it takes attention away from him. This is an issue where I feel very torn because Nero is kind of a larger-than-life villain in Christian circles today because he is viewed as kind of the forefather of Christian persecution, especially in the Roman Empire. But this is a situation where I'm inclined to believe things are exaggerated the way that they are with, I think, the majority of these stories about Nero. Like, I think it's even a large step to say that Nero would kick a pregnant woman to death, especially a woman he claimed to love and a woman that he grieved for so much, his second wife, Poppaea. He grieved for her so much, he eventually married a slave that he castrated because he looked like her. And he even called this slave by Poppaea's name. More likely to me, if she was pregnant, she likely died of childbed fever, or she died of a really hard birth. So I think that's taking it a bit far. I definitely think fiddling while Rome burns is taking it too far. And so I have to say, I really think the kind of widespread persecution of Christians cannot be laid at his door either. I think a lot of things about Nero, sadly enough, were not his own ideas. I think he was surrounded by a lot of really bright minds, a lot of great poets, a lot of great politicians, and a lot of great athletes at that. And he very much wanted to fit into all of these circles. And so he tried his hand at everything, but he wasn't especially great at any one thing. And so I'm inclined to believe that some of these bigger stories likely didn't originate with Nero himself, but that he also didn't disagree with them. So the Domus Aurea is absolutely incredible, and it takes up a wide portion of Rome, and it takes up a lot of money. Actually, Nero devalued the coinage. He was the first Roman emperor to do so. He spent a lot of money on this, and one thing that he interestingly spent a lot of money on was the Colossus, which was a statue of him that was meant to kind of evoke the Colossus of Rhodes, which was a wonder of the ancient world. And this stood close to where the Colosseum is now. Nothing remains of it. It likely fell during the barbarian raids or during some earthquakes, because Rome is prone to those. And so it's not been around in a very, very long time. But there is kind of a rumor that because the Colosseum was standing near the Colossus, that's why it got the nickname the Colosseum, which is an interesting bit of trivia. So after the Great Fire of Rome, there is the conspiracy of Piso, where people like Lucan are condemned and killed. But there is another revolt, which is the one that really cements Nero's downfall. This is the Vindex and Galba revolt. This starts as a revolt about taxes, but it morphs into Galba being declared emperor while Nero is still technically the emperor. And Galba does succeed Nero as the Roman emperor. But people actually like Galba. They like what he has to say. He is so popular, in fact, that Nero is kind of forced to leave Rome. During all of this, the Roman Senate is kind of discussing these issues. They're discussing Galba's popularity. They're discussing Nero's unpopularity. And they kind of decide that it's best to arrest Nero and get rid of him. And so Nero goes to a country villa. He is preparing to commit suicide because he's heard these rumors that the Senate want to kill him. Apparently, he paced around this villa all day, quoting the Aeneid and saying, "What an artist dies in me." I love it. What a drama queen. It's not clear whether he took his own life or whether he had somebody kill him, because there are rumors that he kind of lost the nerve to do it and he had somebody in his household agree to kill him. But at any rate, Nero does die June 9th, 68 AD. Nero's death was largely welcomed, but there was a large segment of the population, particularly in the East, that didn't believe Nero died. In fact, even after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, there are still rumors that Nero didn't die, that Nero's kind of waiting to come back again. And specifically at the time, there were a wide variety of people who firmly believed Nero wasn't dead. There were so many pretenders, people pretending to be Nero, that were actually believed, that it seems pretty clear that there was a large segment of the Roman population that didn't believe he died. There kind of comes to be a whole cult around Nero about whether or not he died. A lot of people fear him coming back. There is kind of a legend in Christian circles that he is the beast, that he is the Antichrist, that he will come back at the end times, that he signals the end times. And so this is a rumor that has gone on to kind of color Nero's image retrospectively as well. And so that's a really interesting aspect of his life, in my opinion. So this is only an introductory video to what will be, I'm sure, a longer Nero series. I'm planning a video on the women in Nero's life who were incredibly fascinating, not just his mother, but his wives, and a woman who he had an affair with who was named Claudia Acti, who is a really, really interesting historical figure. I would also like to do a video on kind of the scholars and the poets that he was surrounded by: Lucan, Seneca, Petronius. And I would like to do a video that's more broadly and largely about the fire of Rome. And if you have any thoughts on Nero, I would love to hear them down below. Do you really believe he's as bad as he's always been portrayed? Do you feel like it's exaggerated? Do you feel like he was actually a good person, like Margaret George kind of does? But that's going to be all from me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.